Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little different. We're not talking about one era, one plague, or one spectacularly bad idea. Tonight we're following one thing across all of history: what women were told to wear, and I mean told, not asked, not suggested. Told, legislated, corseted, cinched, and in many cases literally sewn into. We're talking about roughly 4,000 years of mankind looking at women and saying, you know what, I'm going to have opinions about that. So before you get too comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here, and drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from. Somehow, people send me messages at 3 a.m. from places I have to Google, and I love every single one of you for it. A huge thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. You know who you are, and honestly, you've saved the rest of us from a perfectly unremarkable night's sleep. This channel only exists because people like you keep nudging it forward, and that genuinely means everything. Also, if you're a Spotify person, we're there now, links in the description. Now dim those lights, turn on a fan if you've got one, get horizontal, tuck yourself in, and maybe think about how free you felt the last time you got dressed in whatever you wanted, because a lot of women throughout history never got to feel that. Let's pause for just a moment. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to wear a corset so tight your ribs shifted? Did women in ancient Egypt spend all day adjusting their linen? Did Victorian ladies really faint? Or were they just pretending to get out of social obligations? Which honestly sounds like a reasonable strategy. Was there a moment when someone said, you know what, let's put women in pants, and everyone acted like civilization was ending? Did a queen ever look at the fashion rules and just ignore them? And why, in absolutely every single era of human history, did someone decide the most important thing about a woman was what she was wearing? Congratulations. You've just woken up somewhere in the ancient world and someone has already decided what you're putting on. The year doesn't matter. It could be 1200 BCE, 500 CE, or 1953. It's all the same basic meeting. Men in a room, women being dressed by committee. Welcome to the history of women's fashion, where the only thing more elaborate than the clothes was the reasoning for why they were mandatory. Long before anyone invented the corset or the stiletto heel, ancient Egyptian women were already navigating a world where clothing communicated something: status, morality, fertility, power. The most common fabric was linen, almost universally white or off-white, draped loosely over the body in ways that look effortlessly elegant in tomb paintings, and decidedly less elegant when you imagine the actual logistics of keeping it in place during a full day of activity. For wealthier women, the linen was so finely woven it was described as woven air, nearly translucent, gossamer, the kind of fabric that required professional help just to put on. For everyone else, it was heavier, rougher, and still involved a great deal of strategic tucking. What you wore announced your place in the social hierarchy with more clarity than a business card. The fineness of your linen, the heaviness of your collar, the quality of your wig. And yes, wigs. Many Egyptian women shaved their heads and wore elaborate wigs instead. Whether this was about hygiene, fashion, or both remains a matter of academic debate. But what's clear is that appearance in ancient Egypt was never accidental, never casual, and never entirely your own decision. So picture your morning. You've woken up in ancient Egypt somewhere around 1300 BCE on a decent day. You're not a slave. You're not royalty. You're somewhere in the comfortable middle. You have a wig stand. You have a bronze mirror. You have a small wooden chest containing your oils, your coal, and a length of linen that your household has laundered by beating it against rocks in the Nile. Your morning routine takes about as long as a modern woman's, which is to say, too long, for reasons mostly unrelated to your own preferences. The linen has to be pleated correctly. The collar has to be pinned. The wig, which is human hair woven onto a fibre base, has to be adjusted until it sits correctly, because a crooked wig in a society where appearance signals everything is roughly equivalent to showing up to a board meeting with your shirt on inside out, but more visible and with more theological implications. Now here's the part that makes it interesting. Egyptian women, particularly elite women, had considerably more visible social presence than their counterparts in Greece or Rome would have. They could own property. They could appear in public. Their clothing was not designed to hide them. It was designed to display them, to communicate their family's wealth, their status, their divine favour. The broad, elaborate collar known as the usuk was a status symbol worn by both men and women. Layered rings of faience beads, gold, carnelian, and turquoise, sometimes so heavy it required a counterweight hanging down the back to keep it from pulling the wearer forward. You weren't just dressed, you were architecturally balanced. And then there were the colours. While most linen stayed white or undyed, the accessories told the full story. Blue was associated with the Nile and fertility, green with rebirth and Osiris, gold, obviously, with divinity. The kohl lining the eyes wasn't merely cosmetic, it was protective, both physically against the sun's glare and spiritually against the evil eye. Getting dressed was, in a very literal sense, armouring yourself. Every element meant something. Every choice had a framework. The woman looking at herself in that bronze mirror wasn't just checking whether she looked presentable. She was checking whether she was correctly aligned with the universe that morning, which is honestly a lot of pressure for before breakfast. But then, nobody in the ancient world had ever suggested that getting dressed should be easy. In ancient Greece, the basic garment for women was the chiton, a large rectangle of wool or linen pinned at the shoulders, belted at the waist and falling to the ankle in a series of pleats that looked effortless and required enormous effort to maintain. There was no zipper, no button, no tailored seam to keep the whole arrangement from becoming a tragedy of fabric and poor planning. You were, in essence, wearing a very elegant bedsheet that had been convinced to behave. For Athenian women in particular, the chiton wasn't just clothing, it was compliance made visible. The expectation was that a respectable woman would be covered, modest, and largely invisible in public, her clothing signalling that she was someone's daughter, someone's wife, someone's property. Women from Sparta, famously, wore shorter tunics and moved more freely, which their Athenian counterparts found deeply suspicious and vaguely scandalous. Across the city-states, what a woman wore was a direct commentary on the virtue of the household she came from, which meant that dressing yourself in the morning was never entirely a private act. It was a public declaration made in wool and linen before you had even had breakfast. Let's talk about the practical reality of the chiton, because the paintings make it look serene, and the reality was considerably more athletic. The Doric chiton, the simpler, heavier version, was essentially two large rectangles of wool pinned at both shoulders and belted. The Ionic chiton added more fabric, more pleats, and multiple pins running down both arms to create the kind of floaty, draped sleeve effect you see on marble statues. On marble, it looks like water flowing. In actual wool on an actual human body in the Greek summer, it was hot, heavy, and required constant adjustment. The belt, the zone, could be arranged in various ways to create different silhouettes, but there was a right way and a wrong way, and the wrong way told everyone you had dressed yourself without sufficient attention. The peplos, another common women's garment, added a folded overfold at the top that created a double layer over the torso. More modesty, more fabric, more pinning. Approximately zero comfort, but excellent coverage of the fact that you were sweating. Here's what the chiton was actually communicating. Athenian women of citizen status were not supposed to be in public much. Their lives were organised around the gyneceum, the women's quarters of the house. When they did go out, often to religious festivals, the market or funerals, their clothing had to signal immediately and unmistakably that they were respectable women who belonged to a citizen household. The alternative visual vocabulary, shorter hemlines, bolder colours, less careful draping, was associated with women who were not under the protection of a citizen male, and the social consequences of being read as that kind of woman were significant. So the respectable Athenian woman wrapped herself in all those careful, modest yards of wool, not necessarily because she wanted to, but because the clothing was doing a very specific social job that had very real implications for how she was treated. It was body armour made of fabric, inconvenient, warm, and absolutely mandatory. The Spartan women, meanwhile, wore shorter tunics, exercised publicly, and were considered by Athenians to be basically feral. That Sparta also produced some of the healthiest women in Greece, who survived childbirth at higher rates and lived longer on average, is the kind of detail that history quietly records while everyone else argues about hemlines. In ancient Rome, clothing was not merely clothing, it was law, literally. The Romans had legislation about what different classes of people could wear, including what fabrics, colours and styles were legally permitted depending on your social standing, marital status, and whether you were considered a respectable woman or not. Married Roman women wore the stola, a long tunic layered over an undergarment topped with a palla, a large shawl draped in specific ways that announced, wordlessly but unmistakably, that you were a matron of good standing. The colours available to you, the width of the border on your garment, the quality of your wool, all of it encoded your place in the social order. And if you were not a respectable woman, a slave, an actress, a prostitute, you were actually forbidden from wearing the stola. The stola wasn't just fashion, it was a legal designation, a walking document of status, which means that in Rome, taking someone's clothes was not metaphorical. It was, in a very real sense, taking away their identity, their protections, and their place in society in one efficient, unfabric-related gesture. The stola itself was a fairly substantial garment. It was long, reaching to the feet, and often had a weighted hem to make it hang correctly. Over it went the palla, a large rectangular wrap draped across the shoulder or over the head, in a variety of arrangements depending on the occasion, the weather, and whether you were going to market or attending something religious. Getting the palla to drape correctly was a skill, and a matron who wore hers carelessly was making a statement she probably didn't intend. The instita, a decorative border running along the hem of the stola, advertised your married status to anyone who looked at you from the knees down. Roman streets were extremely good at communicating social information, and a significant portion of that information was encoded in women's hemlines. Now, here is where it gets interesting. Roman women of the wealthy classes were, by the 1st century BCE, increasingly bending the rules. They imported silk from China at extraordinary expense. They wore dyes, saffron yellow, brilliant scarlet, Tyrian purple, that were technically restricted or astronomically expensive. They wore jewellery on a scale that prompted several Roman moralists, including Cato the Elder, to propose legislation limiting the amount of gold and the variety of clothing a woman could own. Cato argued, with the enthusiastic humorlessness that characterised his entire political career, that women's luxury would ruin the Republic. The women of Rome organised public demonstrations against his proposal, showed up to the forum in numbers, and lobbied their husbands and brothers directly until the legislation was repealed. It was one of the first recorded instances of women organising politically around the right to dress how they chose. They won. Cato was furious. The silk kept arriving from China. The deeper irony of Roman clothing law is that it tried to use fashion as a control mechanism and largely failed, because the same wealth that the empire was generating through conquest kept flowing directly into women's wardrobes, and the women who owned that wealth had opinions about it. The stola remained the uniform of Roman virtue, and Roman women wore it over increasingly elaborate, expensive, rule-bending undergarments and accessories, which is, historically speaking, an extremely efficient solution. In the Byzantine Empire, getting dressed was less a personal act and more a theological one. Byzantine clothing, especially for the upper classes and court figures, was saturated in gold. Gold thread embroidered into silk, gold in the borders of robes, gold in the accessories, gold on the footwear. This wasn't merely decorative. In Byzantine thinking, gold reflected divine light. It was the colour of heaven. Wearing it, especially in the elaborate rigid garments of the court, positioned you not just as wealthy, but as cosmically aligned with the sacred order. Women at the imperial court wore robes so stiff with embroidery they could barely bend. The fabrics were so heavy they had to be supported by the wearer's posture alone. Silk was the prestige fabric of the era, controlled by the imperial government, produced in closely guarded workshops, and available only to those the emperor deemed worthy. Wearing unauthorized silk or the wrong shade of imperial purple could, in certain periods, get you killed. Byzantine fashion was, in the most direct sense possible, a matter of life and death dressed up in very beautiful fabric. The Byzantine court operated on a visual logic where every element of appearance was a statement about divine hierarchy. The emperor and empress wore a specific shade of purple, porphyry, that was produced from the murex sea snail and was so expensive, so time-consuming to produce, and so jealously controlled that wearing it without imperial authorization was explicitly treasonous. It wasn't that other purples were forbidden. It was that the specific, exact, verified purple of imperial power could not be replicated by a civilian without declaring in fabric that she intended to rule, which is a remarkably high-stakes dress code by any measure. For the empress and the noble women of the court, daily dress was essentially liturgical performance. The robes were based on the same visual logic as the mosaics covering church walls: flat, frontal, rigid, heavy with symbolic meaning, designed to communicate not the physical reality of a human body, but the spiritual authority of a divine representative. You did not dress to be seen as a woman. You dressed to be seen as a figure in a composition, a living icon in the great symbolic theatre of the Christian Empire. This required, as you might imagine, quite a lot of assistance. The gold-threaded lauros, the imperial scarf worn by the empress, was draped in a specific pattern that had religious significance. The crown was not merely jewellery, it was a sacred object. The cosmetics, pale face, darkened brows, reddened lips, were not beauty standards in the modern sense. They were formal elements of the imperial appearance, as regulated and ritualized as vestments. And yet, beneath all of this theological armour, Byzantine women of the court were extraordinarily politically active. Empress Theodora, wife of Justinian in the 6th century, was by most accounts the co-ruler of the empire, present at councils, involved in military strategy, personally navigating the Nika riots with a famous refusal to flee that Justinian's chroniclers recorded with something between admiration and alarm. She dressed every day in the full weight of imperial gold and sacred purple, and from within that elaborate theologically loaded costume she ran an empire. The clothes were the message, the woman inside them was the power. Sometimes those two things operated in perfect alignment. In Theodora's case, they did. The history of the veil is far older, far more complicated, and far more politically charged than most people realise. Long before the medieval Christian church began mandating head coverings for women, long before Islamic dress codes were codified, women in ancient Mesopotamia were already living under veil laws, and those laws were explicitly about controlling access. In Assyrian society around 1200 BCE, respectable women, the wives and daughters of free men, were required to veil themselves in public. Slaves and prostitutes were forbidden from wearing the veil. The garment was simultaneously a marker of protection and a mark of ownership, a social signifier so powerful that wearing one without permission was a punishable offence. Through Greek, Roman, Byzantine, and medieval Islamic and Christian traditions, the veil kept reappearing in different forms, different fabrics, different rules, different enforcement mechanisms, but always circling the same fundamental questions. Who does a woman's appearance belong to? Who gets to decide what she reveals and what she hides? And what does society gain from turning a piece of cloth into a statement about morality? The Assyrian laws were specific to the point of obsession. The Middle Assyrian laws, dating to approximately 1200 BCE, dedicated considerable text to the regulation of women's veiling. A married woman had to veil outside the home. A concubine accompanying her mistress had to veil. A concubine travelling alone did not veil. A prostitute could not veil. A slave could not veil. The veil communicated at a glance. which category of woman you were, who owned or protected you, and what treatment you could expect from the strangers around you. A prostitute caught veiling could be flogged 50 times, have pitch poured over her head, and have her clothes taken. The veil wasn't a gesture of modesty, it was a legal document worn on the face. Fast forward through the centuries and the same logic reappears in different costumes. Early Christian communities debated women's head coverings with the same intensity that Assyrian lawmakers had brought to the question. St. Paul's instructions in the letters to the Corinthians that women should cover their heads while praying generated centuries of theological argument about what exactly was meant and why. By the medieval period, respectable Christian women in most of Europe were expected to cover their hair, especially after marriage, with veils, wimples, coifs, and various arrangements of linen that varied by region, status, and decade, but consistently communicated that a woman's hair was private, belonging to her husband, and not available for public viewing. A woman who went out bareheaded was making a statement, whether she intended to or not. The same architecture, covering as protection, as ownership, as moral signalling, moved through Islamic legal traditions from the 7th century onward, interpreted differently across different schools of thought, different cultural contexts, and different centuries. What is consistent across all of these traditions is that the piece of cloth on a woman's head or face has almost never been a purely personal decision. It has always carried weight that extends beyond the individual wearing it: political weight, religious weight, the weight of other people's ideas about what womanhood means and who it belongs to. That this remains true in the 21st century is not a coincidence. It is the same argument still running wearing new clothes. If you have ever looked at a medieval painting and done a double take at the structure sitting on a woman's head, you are not alone. The hennin, the tall conical headdress favoured by noblewomen across Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries, reached heights that were, by any reasonable measure, deeply impractical. Some examples exceeded 2 feet in height. Women had to tilt their heads to exit doorways. They had to negotiate furniture, ceilings, and other people's hats with the careful precision of someone navigating a narrow hallway with a very tall bookshelf. And yet, the fashion persisted for over a century because height, in the medieval visual language, meant status. The taller your hat, the more important you were. The more fabric that cascaded from the tip, the wealthier your household. Church authorities periodically objected: too vain, too immodest, too structurally unsound for a house of God. But noblewomen largely carried on wearing their architectural headpieces with the cheerful persistence of people who had given up on ever having comfortable peripheral vision. The hennin came in several varieties, each with its own level of structural ambition. The single hennin was the simpler cone, sometimes reaching a foot or 18 inches. The steeple hennin kept going until it was taller than the woman wearing it. The butterfly hennin, a wide-winged structure stretched over a wire frame, achieved its height horizontally rather than vertically, which solved the doorway problem but introduced an entirely new set of spatial negotiations. All of them required the hair to be concealed, often entirely shaved or plucked from the forehead and temples, to give the headdress a smooth, high-browed foundation, a beauty standard that required medieval women to basically remove their own hairline to meet it. Beauty, in any era, is not for the faint of heart or the well-attached hairline. Now consider the practicalities of daily life in a 2-foot hat. You've risen from bed in your drafty French castle. You've been dressed by attendants, a process that took considerable time even before the hat was involved. The hennin is pinned and attached, a veil of sheer silk or gauze cascading from its tip to your shoulders. You descend the staircase. You duck professionally through the doorway to the great hall. You seat yourself at table, tilting your head back slightly so the cone doesn't catch on the canopy overhead. Your breakfast is served. Someone sneezes across from you and their hat nearly puts out a candle. This is a normal Tuesday. You have not left for Mass yet. The church's objections to the hennin were genuine and sustained. Sermons were preached against horned headdresses. One 15th century French preacher allegedly stood at the door of his church and physically refused entry to women wearing headdresses he considered too elaborate, a scene that presumably required considerable personal courage and a very good sense of spatial awareness. The women largely ignored him, which says something admirable about their priorities. The hennin survived the clergy's complaints, the obvious inconvenience, and the genuine physical challenges of getting through the built environment of the Middle Ages, not because medieval women were irrational, but because they understood something that hasn't changed in 700 years. Within the narrow social world available to them, dressing powerfully was one of the few forms of power they were permitted to exercise. If the hat was their domain, they were going to go as high as physics allowed. The corset is one of the most argued about garments in fashion history, defended by some, condemned by others, and misunderstood by nearly everyone. Its origins lie in the 16th century, when stiffened bodices began reshaping the silhouette of wealthy European women into the straight-fronted, narrow-waisted ideal that Renaissance art celebrated, and medical professionals eventually criticised. By the Victorian era, the corset had become both central to respectable femininity and genuinely physically consequential. Internal organs shifted, ribs realigned, breathing was managed rather than natural. Girls as young as 2 or 3 were placed in stays, early corsets, to begin shaping their bodies toward the fashionable ideal from infancy. Women laced each morning to achieve waists of 16 or 17 inches, and the strangest part is that many women of the era defended the corset vigorously, not as something imposed on them, but as something they chose, a tool of posture, support, and self-presentation in a world that left them very few other tools. The history of the corset is not a simple story of victims and oppressors. It is a far more uncomfortable story about what women were taught to want and why. The 16th century version, the pair of bodies, as it was called, was constructed from 2 layers of heavy fabric stiffened with paste, whalebone, wood, or later steel, and laced tightly over a linen shift. It was designed to compress the waist, flatten the stomach, and push the chest upward into the fashionable décolletage of the era. By the 17th century, the design had been refined. By the 18th, it was ubiquitous across all classes. Working women wore shorter, less restrictive stays that still shaped the torso, while fashionable women wore longer, more aggressively structured versions that achieved the inverted cone silhouette visible in portraits of the period. The corset was not merely an undergarment. It was the foundation of the entire outfit. Everything else, the gown, the petticoats, the carefully constructed silhouette, hung from and around the corset. Take it away and nothing worked. Which, in a very practical sense, is why it was so hard to argue with. The Victorian tight-lacing debate was fought with a genuine ferocity of people who believed civilization was at stake on both sides. Doctors published case studies of corset-related injury, displaced ribs, compressed lungs, liver and stomach deformation. Anti-corset reformers held lectures. Dress reform advocates designed health corsets with less severe lacing. And women, reading these arguments, largely continued to wear their corsets. Because here is the thing that the reformers consistently failed to appreciate. The corset was doing something real for the women wearing it. It provided back support during long days of standing. It created a silhouette that was the visual basis of respectability in a society where appearance communicated everything. It was familiar from childhood, the body shaped around it, accustomed to it, feeling somehow exposed without it. The feminist argument against the corset came later, from women who framed it clearly as a tool of control, a physical manifestation of the restricted life women were expected to live. They were not wrong, but neither were the women who wore it for 50 years and reported feeling held together, supported, properly themselves. The corset's real lesson is about how thoroughly an external constraint can become internalized, how completely what you're taught to want can replace whatever you might have wanted without the teaching, which is something that, once you see it in a Victorian bodice, you start noticing absolutely everywhere. Tudor England had a problem. Too many people were dressing above their station, and the Crown was not happy about it. The solution, predictably, was legislation. Sumptuary laws in 16th century England specified, in considerable detail, who could wear what fabric, what fur, what colour, and what ornamentation based on their rank and income. Velvet was reserved for certain titles. Sable fur could only be worn by those above a specific social rank. The colour purple was so strictly controlled it was essentially reserved for royalty. Wearing the wrong garment wasn't just a fashion faux pas, it was a legal offence, punishable by fine. For women, the rules were layered on top of an already complex set of expectations about modesty, obedience, and the visual performance of virtue. A noblewoman dressed not just for herself, or even for her husband, but for an entire social system that read her clothing as evidence of her household standing. Queen Elizabeth I, delightfully, took the concept of dresser's power to its absolute extreme, amassing a wardrobe of over 2,000 gowns and using every appearance as a calculated performance of divine, unchallengeable authority, which is one way to handle the patriarchy. The Tudor sumptuary laws were passed in waves: 1533, 1540, 1547, 1559, 1574, because they kept not working, which required periodic updating. The fundamental problem was that trade was making more people wealthier, and wealthier people wanted to dress well, and dressing well in Tudor England meant wearing the fabrics and colours that the sumptuary laws kept reserving for people above them. The merchant's wife who could afford crimson velvet was told she could not wear crimson velvet. She wore it anyway. She was fined. She continued wearing it. The fines were not large enough to constitute a genuine deterrent against people who could afford the fabric in the first place, which made the entire system a fairly expensive form of theatre. For women specifically, the sumptuary laws intersected with a broader set of expectations about their role as reflectors of their husband's or father's status. A noblewoman who dressed magnificently was advertising her household's wealth and importance correctly. A merchant's wife who dressed magnificently was disrupting the visual order, pretending to a status she hadn't been born into, which was considered both socially threatening and morally questionable, as if ambition expressed through fabric was a character failing. The irony is rich, given that the entire Tudor court was a performance of status conducted through clothing, and its most dazzling practitioner was the Queen herself. Elizabeth I understood that being seen was being powerful, and she deployed her wardrobe with the strategic precision of a military commander. The white face, the red wig, the enormous jewelled ruffs, the embroidered gowns heavy with symbolic imagery, pearls for purity, phoenixes for rebirth, serpents for wisdom, all of it was communication, not vanity. She was using the only visual language her court understood to say the same thing constantly. I am untouchable, I am eternal, and I am in charge. 2,000 gowns, none of them a mistake. For centuries, respectable women were largely barred from saying a great number of things out loud in public. Society had opinions about that, so instead, women developed entire parallel languages communicated through objects: the angle of a fan, the placement of a glove, the colour of a ribbon, that allowed a vocabulary to exist just below the visible surface of polite society. The language of fans was extensively codified by the Victorian era. A fan held in the left hand in front of the face meant I'm desirous of your acquaintance. A fan resting on the right cheek indicated yes. On the left cheek, no. Opened and shut slowly. It meant I am engaged. This wasn't casual flirting. It was a sophisticated communication system developed by women who had been formally denied the ability to speak directly about their own desires, intentions, and opinions in mixed company. That women invented and maintained an entire secret vocabulary, operating in plain sight, while continuing to be told they had nothing significant to say, is one of history's more quietly astonishing acts of collective ingenuity. The fan itself was a remarkably functional object in the formal social world of the 17th through 19th centuries. Made from silk, paper, lace, or painted vellum, stretched over sticks of ivory, bone, or lacquered wood. A quality fan was an expensive accessory, a social prop, a temperature management device in rooms heated by too many candles and too many people, and a communication tool, all simultaneously. Women carried fans from girlhood. They learned the gestures as naturally as they learned to curtsy. A fan drawn slowly across the cheek, a fan tapped against the chin, a fan snapped shut with a particular energy that communicated irritation more efficiently than a sentence could, especially in a social context where a sentence would have been considered unacceptable. The glove operated in its own parallel register. In a social world where a woman's hand was rarely seen publicly, propriety required gloves in most formal and semi-formal settings, the act of removing a glove was loaded with meaning. Gloves were exchanged as tokens of favour. They were dropped deliberately when words couldn't be spoken. The colour communicated mourning, celebration, or availability depending on the occasion and the shade. A woman removing her right glove at a ball slowly and precisely was doing something that everyone in the immediate vicinity understood, and that would have read as scandalous if translated into words. The vocabulary of accessories is, essentially, the vocabulary of a people who are not permitted a vocabulary, a workaround so elegant it became its own art form. There were published etiquette guides to the language of flowers, the language of stamps on envelopes, the language of where you placed your spoon in your teacup when you'd finished. All of it was a system for women to communicate content in a social framework that insisted they had nothing to say. The ingenuity required to maintain this parallel vocabulary over centuries, across classes and countries, without it ever becoming official, without it ever being codified into law or sanctioned by the institutions that controlled women's lives, that ingenuity is its own kind of extraordinary. They built a second language out of accessories and gestures, and they used it every day, right under everyone's noses, with a fan. Revolutions are, among other things, arguments about who gets to dress how. In France, in the years immediately before and during the Revolution, fashion became explicitly political in ways that would have seemed absurd a decade earlier. The towering powdered wigs of aristocratic women, structures that sometimes reached 3 feet high, and incorporated birds, ships, and garden scenes, became symbols of everything the Revolution was against: excess, privilege, the obscene gap between those who had everything and those who had nothing. When the Revolution came, fashionable aristocratic dress became actively dangerous. Women of the upper classes quietly dismantled their wardrobes, their wigs, and their silk stockings in favour of simpler, plainer clothing that announced ordinary citizenship rather than elevated birth. On the other side, revolutionary women adopted the tricolour cockade, white muslin dresses evoking the simplicity of republican virtue, and styles that deliberately referenced ancient Rome, the Republic, the civic ideal. What you wore announced your political loyalties, and in the years of the Terror, wearing the wrong thing at the wrong moment was, in a very literal sense, a capital offence. The Ancien Régime silhouette for aristocratic women was a monument to conspicuous consumption. The robe à la Française, its back pleats, its side hoops spreading skirts to 3 feet on either side, its elaborate embroidered stomacher, required yards of expensive silk brocade, professional dressmakers, regular maintenance, and enough time in the morning to dress that it essentially announced that you had nothing important to do that day. The towering hairstyles, called poufs, built on wire frames over padded horsehair foundations, rising sometimes to 30 inches above the head, and decorated with feathers, flowers, ribbons, and occasionally miniature scenes depicting current events, were cultural phenomena and also genuine structural achievements that required specialists to construct and hours to sit through. They were extraordinary. They were also, by the standards of a country where 1/3 of the population was going hungry, absolutely indefensible. which the people doing the going hungry noticed. When the revolution arrived, the guillotine worked quickly and fashion followed almost as fast. Aristocratic women who had escaped arrest navigated the new social landscape by dressing down with the same precision their mothers had dressed up, seeking fabrics and silhouettes that didn't announce wealth, avoiding the jewellery and ornamentation that had been status markers 6 months earlier, learning to read a crowd's mood from its clothing before entering it. The tricolour cockade, a small rosette in red, white and blue, became mandatory for all French citizens by decree in 1793. Women who were not wearing one could be stopped, searched and arrested. A decoration became a document. And on the other side of the revolution, in the years of the Directory, the pendulum swung again. Wealthy women adopting near-transparent muslin gowns with bare arms and minimal undergarments, referencing ancient Greece in what fashion historians called the neoclassical style, and what their contemporaries called alarming. In France, between 1785 and 1800, you could track the entire political trajectory of a nation through what women were wearing, which makes the clothes, in a very direct sense, the history. In the 1850s and 1860s, skirts reached a circumference that, by any practical measure, had simply gone too far. The crinoline, a cage-like underskirt made of steel hoops, could expand a woman's silhouette to 6 feet across at the hem, turning every social gathering into a spatial puzzle and every staircase into a structural negotiation. Women wearing full crinoline dresses could not sit down comfortably in most chairs, could not walk through doorways side by side with other women, and had to enter carriages with considerable athletic commitment. The hazards were legendary and frequently fatal. Crinoline skirts caught fire at an extraordinary rate, sweeping too close to fireplaces and candles in the poorly lit rooms of the era. They were caught in machinery, in carriage wheels and closing doors. Newspapers of the period ran regular notices of women killed or seriously injured by their own skirts, and yet the fashion persisted for 20 years, because the crinoline also represented something real to the women wearing it. A physical expansion of space in an era when women's social, legal and intellectual space was aggressively contracted. Sometimes the subtext of fashion is right there in the structure. Before the steel cage crinoline arrived in the early 1850s, the same silhouette was being achieved through sheer volume of fabric. Multiple layers of heavy petticoats, sometimes 6 or 7, worn simultaneously and stiffened with horsehair fabric at the hem to hold the bell shape out. This required carrying an extraordinary amount of weight around your lower body all day, every day, which gives you a sense of how enthusiastically women embraced the steel cage when it arrived. The cage crinoline was lighter than 6 petticoats. It moved with you. It bounced back when compressed. Compared to what it replaced, it was practically athletic wear. The technology was genuinely clever. Concentric steel hoops of graduated sizes, connected by fabric tapes, creating a collapsible frame that held the skirt out without the weight. Women loved it. Factories produced them by the million. By 1860, they were available in every price range, worn by factory workers and duchesses alike, which was itself remarkable in an era when fashion filtered extremely slowly down the class structure. The engineering problems it created, however, were spectacular. 6 feet of skirt circumference means 3 feet of radius in every direction. 3 feet of skirt extending in front of you, behind you, to both sides. Sitting required a specific technique, approaching the chair from a particular angle, compressing the front of the cage, and lowering carefully so the back hoops rose gracefully, rather than flipping the entire skirt forward over your head, which happened publicly, more often than anyone involved wished to acknowledge. Staircases required lifting and managing the hem to avoid catching on steps, which solved one problem and immediately created another, because managing your hem with your hands at waist height while ascending stairs in a corset with restricted breathing capacity is approximately as graceful as it sounds. The fires were the genuine tragedy of the crinoline era. In an age of open fireplaces, gas lamps and candles, A skirt with a circumference of 6 feet was perpetually within ignition range of something. The fabric, typically a light wool or silk, caught quickly. The cage hoops created a bellows effect that fed oxygen to the flames. Women died at rates that prompted newspapers to run editorial campaigns against the fashion. Factories reported workers losing their lives when skirts were caught in machinery. And still the crinolines sold, and still women wore them, and the explanation is not that women were irrational. The explanation is that in 1858, taking up space was one of the only ways available to make yourself unmistakably, incontrovertibly present in a world that kept trying to make you smaller. By the 1880s, a small, furious, magnificently determined group of women had decided that enough was enough. The Rational Dress Society was founded in London in 1881 with a deceptively simple premise. Women's clothing should not damage their health or impede their physical movement. This sounds like the most obvious thing in the world. It was, at the time, wildly controversial. The society published pamphlets. They held exhibitions. They advocated for divided skirts, an early form of culottes, that allowed women to cycle, climb, and move without the constant negotiation of multiple petticoats and a tightly laced waist. Doctors wrote letters of support citing organ displacement and breathing restrictions. The press largely responded with mockery. Cartoonists drew unflattering portraits of mannish women in sensible shoes. The reaction to women asking to dress comfortably was treated with remarkable consistency as a sign of civilization in decline, a pattern that would repeat itself with every subsequent generation of women who had the audacity to prioritize function over performance. The Rational Dress Society was founded by Viscountess Florence Harberton and Mary Ann Eliza Horton, two women who had apparently reached their absolute limit with the prevailing state of women's clothing and decided to do something about it in the most organised way possible. Their position paper established that no woman should be required to wear more than 7 pounds of undergarments, a number that tells you a great deal about the baseline they were working against, because they felt the need to specify a maximum weight for underwear. 7 pounds. For context, a healthy newborn baby weighs approximately 7 pounds. Victorian women were routinely walking around with the equivalent of a newborn baby's worth of undergarments before they put on their actual clothes. The Rational Dress Society considered this excessive. They were not wrong. Their proposed alternatives were modest by any modern standard. Divided skirts that looked like wide-legged trousers but retained the general visual impression of a skirt from a distance. Looser bodices without tight boning. Lower heels. The ability to raise one's arms above shoulder height without the construction of the bodice working against you. A capability that seems so basic it barely needs naming, except that existing women's fashion had, in many cases, engineered it out. The reforms were not revolutionary. They were, by any reasonable measure, the bare minimum of physical functionality. The response they generated was anything but minimal. Punch magazine ran cartoons of rational dress women as goggle-eyed, horse-faced figures in baggy trousers, aggressively unattractive by the standards of the day, because the implication was clear. Women who refused to be physically constrained were also refusing to be visually appealing, and a woman who was not visually appealing was a woman who had failed at her fundamental purpose. This logic was never stated quite so plainly in polite company. It didn't need to be. The cartoon said it efficiently enough. The women of the Rational Dress Society largely ignored the cartoons, continued publishing their pamphlets, continued wearing their divided skirts, and watched as the bicycle craze of the 1890s made their entire argument for them more effectively than any pamphlet ever could. When cycling became fashionable, and women needed to actually pedal, divided skirts stopped being radical and started being practical. The cartoonists moved on to other targets. The sensible shoes remained. In 1851, Amelia Bloomer published in her newspaper a description of a new style of women's dress. A short skirt worn over loose trousers gathered at the ankle. She did not invent the style. Her friend Elizabeth Smith Miller did. but her name attached to it so firmly that bloomers entered the language permanently. The reaction was immediate, widespread, and entirely disproportionate. Newspapers declared the end of domestic harmony. Clergymen gave sermons. Men wrote concerned letters about what would become of society if women were allowed to walk without encumbrances. The bloomers themselves were not particularly radical. They covered considerably more of the body than many contemporary men's fashions. But they allowed movement. They allowed a woman to step up onto a curb, mount a bicycle, or walk briskly without architectural negotiation. 40 years later, when the bicycle craze swept through the 1890s and women needed practical clothes to ride, the bloomer controversy resurfaced with identical energy. The bicycle, one editorial warned, would be the ruin of women. What the bicycle actually was, of course, was transportation, freedom of physical movement, and therefore freedom of everything else that followed. The panic about what women wore while riding it tells you everything you need to know about why the panic existed. The original bloomer costume, the short skirt over Turkish-style trousers, was introduced to American readers through Amelia Bloomer's temperance newspaper, The Lily, in 1851. Bloomer wore the outfit herself. She described it enthusiastically. Her readers wrote in asking for patterns. Within months, the style had spread far enough to generate a national conversation, which in 1851 meant a national argument conducted primarily through newspaper editorials, church bulletins, and the letters columns of publications that had very strong opinions about women's ankles. The costume showed the ankle. The ankle, apparently, was the front line of civilization. The women who adopted the bloomer costume in the early 1850s were, in the main, connected to the women's rights movement, the same circle of reformers who were organising for suffrage, for property rights, for access to education. Elizabeth Cady Stanton wore bloomers. Susan B. Anthony wore bloomers, briefly, before concluding that the clothing debate was consuming so much energy it was distracting from the suffrage argument. She eventually returned to conventional dress, not because she had changed her mind about comfort, but because she had calculated that the political cost of looking unconventional was higher than the physical cost of wearing a corset. This is the kind of strategic compromise that the history books rarely fully convey. Women were constantly doing math about which battles to fight, and the math was genuinely difficult. 40 years later, the bicycle arrived and made the math considerably simpler. The safety bicycle, chain-driven, with 2 equal-sized wheels, became available to middle-class consumers in the late 1880s and immediately became a phenomenon. Women wanted to ride. Women needed practical clothing to ride. The divided skirt, the reformed bloomer, the shortened hem, all of it became suddenly, urgently necessary rather than ideologically provocative. The same newspapers that had mocked rational dress reformers for a decade quietly shifted their coverage towards cycling fashions and practical riding dress. The clothing hadn't changed. The context had. Practicality, introduced through a piece of popular technology, accomplished in 3 years what 30 years of pamphlets had not. The bicycle gave women somewhere to go. The clothes were just what they wore to get there. In the 1890s, artist Charles Dana Gibson began drawing a particular type of woman. Tall, poised, with a pompadour hairstyle, a small waist cinched by a shirtwaist blouse, and a long skirt that swept the ground. He called no single woman the Gibson girl. She was a composite ideal, a sketch repeated in hundreds of illustrations across the country's most widely read magazines. By the turn of the 20th century, she had become the template against which American women were measured. Women spent money they frequently didn't have on the specific blouses, hairstyles, and skirt shapes that approximated the Gibson girl aesthetic. Advertisers used her image to sell everything from soap to cigars. She projected something new, an aspirational, educated, slightly sporty femininity that was more modern than Victorian rigidity, but still safely, soothingly beautiful by conventional standards. That a single illustrator's personal aesthetic could dictate what millions of real women felt obligated to look like, purely through the medium of repeated publication, is one of the earliest and most efficient demonstrations of how media shapes female self-presentation, a mechanism that has never stopped operating, just changed its delivery system. The Gibson girl looked achievable. That was the genius of her. She was not a queen or a goddess or a figure from mythology. She was recognizably a contemporary American woman, well-dressed, composed, holding a tennis racket or stepping out of a carriage or reading a letter with an expression of wry amusement. She seemed like someone you might know, or someone you might be if you got your hair and your blouse quite right. The pompadour, hair piled high over a pad of false hair swept back from the face, was specific enough that women could follow instructions. The shirtwaist blouse, with its puffed sleeves and high collar, was specific enough that department stores could stock it. The long gored skirt was specific enough to copy from a pattern. The Gibson girl was, in effect, a consumer template, an ideal constructed from purchasable components, arriving in an era when mass manufacturing had made purchasing those components possible for the middle class for the first time. Gibson himself was somewhat ambivalent about the phenomenon he'd created. He drew the Gibson girl as an independent figure. She was witty, she was athletic, she occasionally appeared to be running circles around the hapless men around her. He was not trying to create a prison, but the way the image functioned in the broader culture was not entirely within his control, because an ideal, once published and repeated and merchandised, stops belonging to its creator and starts belonging to the anxiety of every woman looking at it, and measuring the distance between the illustration and her own mirror. The Gibson girl's waist was not achievable without a corset. Her height was not average. Her composure was not natural. It was the composure of a drawing, which never gets tired or frustrated or rumpled after a long day. And yet there she was, on the cover of every magazine, in every advertisement, in the wallpaper patterns and the decorative plates, and the souvenir fans sold at department stores. By 1900, the Gibson girl was not just a fashion, she was the heir. The First World War did something to women's fashion that decades of rational dress advocacy had failed to accomplish. It made practicality non-negotiable. When significant proportions of the male workforce disappeared into the trenches, women moved into factories, offices, transport systems and medical services, jobs that required clothing that could actually be worked in. The long trailing skirts of the Edwardian era became instantaneously impractical. Hemlines rose to the mid-calf, waistlines relaxed. Restrictive foundation garments gave way to more functional options. Women cut their hair. The changes were not welcomed by everyone. There were plenty of voices lamenting the loss of femininity, the coarsening of women, the troubling masculinization of the female form. But here is the thing about practicality during a crisis. It tends to win. Women who spent the war years moving efficiently, working physically demanding jobs, and managing their own lives in the absence of the men who had previously organized those lives for them, did not, when the war ended, simply slip back into the elaborate physical restrictions of pre-war dress. Some of them did. But the hem, once raised, had a tendency to stay raised. In 1914, the fashionable Edwardian silhouette still featured a long sweeping skirt, a structured waist, and a hat of considerable ambition. Women's clothing was still organized around the assumption that its wearer would be largely stationary, attending, receiving, presiding over domestic arrangements, moving in a supervised social circuit. The factory floor had a different set of requirements. A hem that swept the ground, collected grease, caught on machinery, and constituted a safety hazard in workshops that were already dangerous enough. Hair pinned up under elaborate hats was quickly replaced by hair pinned up under caps or turbans. Corsets were replaced or loosened. You cannot load shells or operate machinery while your breathing is being architecturally managed by whalebone stays. The women who went to work in munitions factories, in transport depots, in hospitals and offices, adapted their dress with the same practical efficiency they brought to every other aspect of the work, because the work needed doing, and the existing clothes were in the way. What nobody fully anticipated was that working in functional clothing for 4 years would change what clothing felt like, that the body, accustomed to moving freely, to breathing without constraint, to not carrying an architectural agenda around its lower half every day, would not simply accept the return of the Edwardian silhouette as if nothing had happened. Some women went back to longer skirts and structured bodices, but the overall trajectory of women's fashion from 1918 onward moved consistently in one direction. Less fabric, less restriction, more movement. The 1920s transformation, the dropped waistline, the shorter hem, the flattened silhouette, did not come from nowhere. It came directly from a generation of women who had spent 4 years discovering what their bodies could do when their clothes allowed it. The war gave them work, the work gave them the clothes gave them the data, and the data was conclusive. The 1920s produced one of the most dramatic silhouette shifts in the entire history of Western fashion, and it arrived with such velocity that older generations genuinely believed they were watching civilization end. The flapper silhouette, straight, boyish, dropped waist, hemline at the knee, was not just a fashion choice. It was a full-scale rejection of the previous century's ideals about the female body. The hourglass that the Victorian corset had sculpted for decades was abandoned almost overnight. Breasts were flattened by binders, hips were de-emphasized, hair was cropped. The physical ideal shifted from a body that announced fertility and domestic readiness to a body that announced freedom and movement. Clothing became, for the first time in mainstream fashion history, genuinely compatible with dancing, running, and existing without structured support. The moral panic was, of course, enormous. Clergymen preached against short skirts from coast to coast. Several American state legislatures introduced bills, none successful, to mandate minimum skirt lengths. Utah proposed a fine for skirts more than 3 inches above the ankle, and women kept shortening their skirts anyway, which tells you a fair amount about whose opinions they were interested in. The speed of the shift was genuinely shocking to those living through it. In 1919, hemlines were at the ankle. By 1925, they were at the knee. By 1927, some evening fashions were approaching the mid-thigh. This was not a gradual cultural drift. This was a generation making a deliberate visual break with everything that had come before, in real time, with full awareness of how it was being received and proceeding anyway. The bob haircut, short, sleek, cut above the jaw, was adopted by millions of women despite, or possibly because of, the reliable fury it generated from fathers, husbands, employers, and newspaper editors who treated a woman cutting her hair as a kind of personal betrayal. It was just hair. It was never just hair. The clothes themselves were, structurally speaking, a revelation. The shift dress, straight from shoulder to hem, requiring no corset, no petticoats, no infrastructure of undergarments to make it work, could be put on and taken off without assistance. For the first time in centuries, a fashionable woman did not require help to get dressed in the morning. This sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing. Independence of dress is independence of a particular and daily kind. The ability to clothe yourself, to leave when you choose, to not be physically dependent on another person to fasten what you're wearing. The practical implications of a dress you could put on alone were not lost on the women putting them on. The Charleston, the era's defining dance, required a kind of physical freedom that the previous generation's fashion had made literally impossible. You cannot Charleston in a hobble skirt. You cannot Charleston in a corset laced to 17 inches. The dress followed the dance, or the dance followed the dress, or they arrived together as part of the same cultural moment that also produced jazz and speakeasies and women voting for the first time. All of it was connected. All of it was a generation deciding, with the emphatic clarity that tends to follow catastrophic war, that the old rules were not coming back. By the 1930s, a new force had entered the business of telling women what to wear and what to look like. The Hollywood film industry, which understood earlier than almost any other institution how completely a moving image could reshape mass desire. The studios created a system of glamour that was meticulously designed, enormously expensive, and presented to audiences as natural beauty. Stars photographed from specific angles, corseted and structured beneath their costumes, lit to emphasize particular features, and supported by entire departments dedicated to the maintenance of a physical ideal that was, in most cases, physiologically unavailable to the women watching from the dark of the cinema. Costume designers like Adrian at MGM and Edith Head at Paramount became cultural forces of their own, their creations copied by department stores within weeks of a film's release. Women who could never afford the actual garment could buy a pattern, buy the fabric, and approximate the look on a home sewing machine. Hollywood didn't just reflect fashion, it manufactured desire, a desire for a particular version of femininity that was simultaneously aspirational and, by design, always slightly out of reach. The studio system approached female appearance with an efficiency that was, depending on your perspective, either impressive or alarming. A new contract actress arriving at a major studio in the 1930s would be assessed by the studio's makeup department, hair department, wardrobe department, and sometimes dental department before she was considered ready to be photographed. Her nose might be reshaped through strategic contouring. Her hair colour would be selected to suit the studio's lighting. Her weight would be monitored and managed. Studios routinely placed actresses on strict dietary regimens to maintain specific measurements because Adrian's bias-cut gowns, which defined the glamour of the era, required a particular silhouette to drape correctly, and the silhouette was not negotiable. What was being manufactured and sold to audiences as natural elegance was, in nearly every case, an engineered product, the result of industrial-scale image management applied to a human being. The effect on the women watching was structural in a way that earlier fashion media, fashion plates, Gibson Girl illustrations, magazines, had not quite achieved. A photograph was static. A moving image was something else entirely. You watched Joan Crawford walk across a room in a dress Adrian had built for her specific body and her specific lighting, and what you received was not just an image but an experience. The feeling of glamour itself, conveyed kinetically, durably, in a way that stayed in the mind considerably longer than a magazine page. The emotional residue of that experience translated practically into purchasing behaviour. Department stores tracked which stars' looks generated the most copy requests. Patterns were rushed to market. The Letty Linton dress, a white organdy creation with enormous ruffled shoulders that Adrian designed for Joan Crawford in 1932, was copied in 500,000 versions within months of the film's release. 500,000 women buying the same dress because they had watched someone else wear it in the dark. Hollywood had not just entered the fashion business, it had reorganized it entirely around the moving image of a woman on screen. The Second World War returned women to practicality with even greater efficiency than the First. In Britain, the utility clothing scheme was introduced in 1941, placing formal restrictions on the amount of fabric permitted in civilian garments. No unnecessary pleats, no wide lapels, no elaborate decorations, no excessive hem lengths. Clothing was rationed like food, and women were issued coupons that determined how much they could buy per year. The result was a fashion driven entirely by function. Shoulder lines were sharp because they required less material. Skirts were straight because fullness used up precious fabric, and quality of construction was regulated by the government because poorly made clothes wore out faster and required more rationing coupons to replace. In the United States, a different set of wartime restrictions produced similar lines. The War Production Board's L85 regulations limited hem circumference, back pleats, and excess fabric across the board. Women sewed their own clothes from whatever was available, repaired worn garments, and improvised. Bare legs, once socially unacceptable in public, became ordinary as silk and nylon were diverted to parachutes. Women drew lines up the backs of their legs in pencil, to simulate the seams of stockings they couldn't obtain. Practicality, once again, turned out to be surprisingly elegant when it had no other choice. The British utility scheme was administered by the Board of Trade and enforced with the kind of precision that wartime government brought to everything it decided mattered. The utility mark, two interlocking circles forming a pattern that appeared on everything from furniture to fabric, indicated government-approved, regulation-compliant production. Utility clothing was not glamorous by design. It was not supposed to be. It was supposed to last, to use minimal resources, and to be available to women across all economic levels at controlled prices. The designers brought in to make the utility scheme aesthetically viable. Hardy Amies, Norman Hartnell, and others worked within the constraints to produce something that was, by the end, genuinely good. Clean lines, quality construction, nothing wasted. The restrictions that were supposed to make clothing worse, in the hands of skilled designers working with serious intent, produced something that fashion historians have since described as unexpectedly elegant. The Make Do and Mend campaigns, government initiatives instructing women to repair and repurpose existing clothing rather than buying new, generated an entire domestic culture of creative improvisation. Men's suits were unpicked and remade into women's jackets. Curtains became dresses. Parachute silk, when women could get it, became wedding gowns, which is either romantic or practical depending on how you look at it, and during a war the answer is probably both. Women embroidered, darned, turned collars, let down hems, and took in waists with a skill and inventiveness born of necessity. The lipstick was kept. This is documented. When almost everything else was rationed or unavailable, British women maintained their lipstick with a tenacity that the Board of Trade eventually recognised as a morale issue and chose not to regulate. Some lines, it turned out, could not be crossed even in wartime. The stocking seam drawn up the back of the leg in eyebrow pencil is one of history's smaller acts of determined elegance. In a world that had taken nearly everything, women kept the line. In February 1947, Christian Dior unveiled a collection that fashion editors immediately called the New Look, and the name stuck because it was genuinely new, or rather dramatically old. After years of wartime practicality and straight functional lines, Dior presented a silhouette of enormous billowing skirts reaching to the mid-calf, cinched waists and rounded shoulders, a look that required approximately 20 yards of fabric per skirt and the reintroduction of structured foundation garments to achieve. The fashion press was rapturous. The public response was considerably more complicated. Women who had spent years managing on ration coupons and making do with minimal fabric looked at the extravagant yardage of the New Look and reacted with something that, in several documented cases, reached actual fury. In London, protesters gathered outside fashion houses. A women's group in Dallas, Texas, calling themselves the Little Below the Knee Club, organised formal opposition to the longer hemline. Government officials in several countries called the style wasteful and unpatriotic. Dior received death threats, and yet the New Look spread quickly and almost universally because it offered something women had been deprived of for the better part of a decade: the uncomplicated luxury of beautiful clothes. The debate about what that said about female agency and manufactured desire was going to take decades to work through. Dior himself described his motivation with a clarity that was either honest or deeply calculated depending on your sympathies. He wanted, he said, to restore joy to fashion. He wanted to give women back their femininity after years of wartime severity. The choice of the word back is interesting, because it implies that femininity had been lost rather than set aside, and that it was located specifically in a particular silhouette: the cinched waist, the full skirt, the padded hip, rather than in the women themselves. This framing bothered a number of women at the time, and has bothered fashion historians consistently since. The New Look was not restoring anything that women had lost. It was prescribing something specific about what women should look like in the post-war world, softer, rounder, domestic, elaborately constructed, at precisely the moment when those same women were being encouraged to leave the factories and offices they had occupied during the war and return to their homes. The timing was not subtle. Whether it was coordinated is another question. Dior was a designer, not a social policy instrument, and his aesthetic instincts were genuine. But fashion does not exist in a vacuum, and the new look arrived at a cultural moment when the question of what women would do after the war, whether they would remain in the workforce, whether they would maintain the independence the war years had given them, was very much unresolved. A silhouette that required a girdle, a padded hip, a boned bodice, and 20 yards of skirt to execute was a silhouette that required, structurally, quite a lot of time and quite a lot of help. It was a beautiful argument for staying home. Many women found it irresistible, others found it enraging. Both responses made complete sense, which is exactly what happens when a dress is doing more than covering a body. The 1950s produced one of fashion history's most recognisable and most loaded silhouettes. The full-skirted, nipped waist, feminine ideal that appeared on the covers of every women's magazine, in every advertisement for every domestic product, and in the conscious and unconscious dressing choices of millions of women navigating a post-war culture that had very specific ideas about what womanhood should look like. The full skirt required crinolines, underskirts stiffened with nylon net, that rustled when you walked and required considerable space to sit down in. The waist was structured, the neckline modest, the shoes pointed and heeled. This was clothing that said in every possible visual register, home, domesticity, femininity, safety. For a country processing the trauma of war and deeply invested in a particular vision of stable, orderly family life, the housewife silhouette was both fashion and ideology expressed through fabric. Women who didn't conform to it, who wore pants to the grocery store, who kept their wartime practicality, who cut their hair too short or their skirts too long, were not merely unfashionable. They were, in the social language of the decade, suspicious, expressing something problematic about their commitment to the correct version of womanhood. The magazines of the era are worth looking at carefully because the messaging was consistent to the point of coordination. Every advertisement for every domestic product, refrigerators, washing machines, cake mixes, floor wax, featured a woman in the correct silhouette. Full skirt, cinched waist, heels. Often an apron over the skirt, which raised the question of why you would wear heels to clean the kitchen, but the heels were not about function. The heels were about the argument the image was making, that domestic work was not merely labour but performance, a carefully maintained presentation of femininity conducted in appropriate costume. The woman in the advertisement was not just cleaning her kitchen. She was demonstrating, visually, the correct answer to the post-war question of what women were for. The corsetry industry, recognising its opportunity, rebranded aggressively for the decade. The waspy, a short corset targeting only the waist, and the long-line bra and girdle combination became the understructure of the 50s silhouette. Advertisements promised that the right foundation garment would give any woman the fashionable shape. Department stores ran fitting rooms staffed by corsetiers who would assess your natural proportions and recommend the appropriate structure to correct them. The language was entirely medical in its confidence and entirely commercial in its implications. Your body, as it naturally existed, was insufficient. The correct product would fix it. This is not a uniquely 1950s argument, but it was made with particular directness and particular cultural authority during that decade, backed by the full weight of post-war advertising budgets and the cheerful, relentless images of women in full skirts standing in front of gleaming appliances, looking like the answer to a question nobody had actually asked them. The history of women wearing trousers is, functionally, the history of a 200-year argument about whether women were allowed to be comfortable, and the level of social force deployed against the idea is genuinely staggering in retrospect. In 1800, women wearing trousers in public in most Western countries were subject to arrest. Paris had a law on the books from 1799 technically prohibiting women from wearing male dress without police permission. A version of that law technically remained on the French books until 2013. The scandal over bloomers in the 1850s, the controversy over women cyclists in the 1890s, the furor over Marlene Dietrich's tailored suits in the 1930s, and the ongoing dress codes enforcing skirts in schools and workplaces well into the 1970s, all of it was the same argument, repeated across different eras with the same essential energy. The remarkable thing is not that the argument existed. The remarkable thing is how long it took to resolve, and how much cultural force was required to achieve the resolution, and how many women paid real professional and social penalties along the way for the act of putting on a pair of trousers in the morning. The Paris Ordinance of 1799 was not primarily concerned with fashion. It was concerned with social order, specifically with the revolutionary-era phenomenon of women participating publicly in political life, attending assemblies, marching and demonstrations, organising. Women in trousers were women in motion, women in public, women in spaces that the post-revolutionary French government was increasingly anxious to reclaim as male. The clothing prohibition was, in that sense, a mobility prohibition dressed up in fabric law. You cannot march as efficiently in skirts and petticoats. You cannot climb, run, or ride as easily. Requiring women to wear skirts was, practically speaking, a way of slowing them down. Whether the legislators understood it in precisely those terms is unclear. The effect was the same regardless. Marlene Dietrich in the 1930s wore tailored trousers with the casual authority of someone who had simply decided the argument was over, and the images from that period, Dietrich in wide-legged trousers and a blazer, hands in pockets, looking directly at the camera with total composure, remain some of the most arresting photographs of the century. She was banned from France for a period for cross-dressing. She returned wearing trousers. Katharine Hepburn, at roughly the same time, wore trousers so consistently on the RKO studio lot that studio personnel reportedly hid her trousers to force her into skirts. She walked onto the lot in her underwear until they gave them back. This story may be apocryphal. It is also entirely plausible given what we know about Katharine Hepburn, and the fact that it circulates says something true about the level of institutional resistance women faced when they tried to dress functionally in professional environments. The workplace dress codes that required skirts persisted with remarkable tenacity. Female flight attendants were required to wear skirts and heels through much of the 1960s and into the 70s. Female news anchors were assessed on their wardrobe in ways their male counterparts were not. Female politicians navigating the 1980s power-dressing era found that trouser suits, while increasingly acceptable, still generated commentary that would never have attached to a man in equivalent clothing. The comment was always some version of the same thing. Are you sure you want to look like that? The implication being that looking like someone who prioritized function over performance was a statement about your femininity, and your femininity was everyone's business. 200 years, the same conversation, just wearing trousers. When Mary Quant introduced the miniskirt in London in the early 1960s, or Yves Saint Laurent in Paris, depending on who you ask, and both of them would like you to ask, what arrived on the fashion scene was not merely a hemline shift, it was a generational declaration. The baby boom generation, the first cohort of women with access to the contraceptive pill, with higher education, with economic independence to a degree their mothers had not enjoyed, expressed something about themselves through clothing that went considerably beyond aesthetics. The mini meant movement. It meant the body was not something to be covered, managed, and minimized, but something young and kinetic and present. The backlash was immediate and came from familiar directions: religious authorities, older generations, men who wrote letters to newspapers. The fashion was called immoral, vulgar, dangerous. A woman in a miniskirt was said to be asking for it, a phrase with legal as well as social implications that would take decades of feminist argument to begin dismantling. Meanwhile, women wore their minis and kept dancing. Mary Quant opened her shop bazaar on the King's Road in Chelsea in 1955. and for the next decade she did something that most of the fashion establishment had not thought to do. She designed clothes for young women, priced for young women, cut with young women's actual energy and movement in mind. The hemline that became the miniskirt did not arrive as a single decisive moment. It crept upward incrementally, each season a little shorter, each season generating a fresh round of newspaper commentary, each season selling out in Quant's shop faster than the previous one. By 1965, the hem was at mid-thigh, and the fashion press had run out of new ways to describe the scandal. By 1967, it was higher still. The women buying the clothes were not reading the editorials about them. They were dancing at discotheques in Biba and Quant and Courrèges, and not particularly concerned with the opinions of people who weren't dancing. The mod aesthetic that surrounded the mini, the geometric prints, the bold blocks of colour, the white go-go boots, the false eyelashes, was a complete visual system, a coherent argument made in fabric and cosmetics about youth, futurity, and the decisive rejection of everything the 1950s had represented. Where the 50s silhouette was rounded, soft and domestic, the mod silhouette was angular, graphic, and emphatically public. Where the 50s ideal covered and structured and contained, the mod ideal revealed and simplified and moved. The clothes looked like the future. That was entirely intentional. The contraceptive pill, approved in the United States in 1960 and available across most of Western Europe through the early 60s, changed the practical mathematics of women's lives in ways that clothing immediately reflected. A woman who could control her own reproduction was a woman who could plan a professional life, a financial life, a social life, on different terms than any previous generation. That this new freedom expressed itself partly through shorter skirts is not a coincidence. The body that was now, for the first time, meaningfully under its owner's control was also the body that the owner chose to put on visible display. The connection between reproductive autonomy and sartorial freedom is not metaphorical. It is structural. And the people who were most alarmed by the miniskirt in 1965 understood, even if they couldn't articulate it precisely, that the hemline and the pill were part of the same argument. In a century of fashion figures who told women what they ought to wear and why, Gabrielle Coco Chanel stands slightly apart, not because she was without commercial motive or personal complexity, but because her aesthetic project was, at its core, about removing things, removing the corset, removing the excessive ornamentation, removing the layers that restricted movement and announced status through conspicuous discomfort. Chanel borrowed from menswear. She used jersey, a fabric previously considered too casual and functional for fashion. She popularized trousers for women on the French Riviera, when it was still genuinely shocking. She cut her own hair short in 1917 and watched the style spread. The Chanel suit, braid-trimmed, comfortable, functional, elegant, became one of the most copied garments in 20th century fashion history because it offered something that most women's fashion historically had not. Clothes you could actually work in, think in, and move through your own life in, while still being considered impeccably dressed. That this was considered revolutionary is worth sitting with for a moment. Chanel's early career was built on a series of deliberate provocations that she framed as simplicity. In the 1910s, when women's fashion still meant elaborate construction, multiple layers, and significant structural undergarments, Chanel began making clothes from jersey, a knit fabric used for men's underwear, and presenting them as leisure wear for wealthy women on holiday. The wealthy women bought them. The fashion establishment was confused and then, gradually alarmed, because Chanel's clothes looked effortless in a way that existing fashion deliberately did not, and effortlessness was threatening to an industry built on visible complexity. If women could look this good in jersey, what were all the other layers for? The little black dress, introduced by Chanel in 1926 and published in American Vogue alongside a prediction that it would become a kind of uniform, is worth examining as a specific act of fashion philosophy. Black before Chanel was mourning wear. It was not fashionable. It was not aspirational. It was the colour you wore when someone had died and you needed to signal grief to the street. Chanel took mourning's colour and stripped it of its meaning, turning it into a neutral canvas, a dress that could be worn anywhere, dressed up or down with accessories, appropriate for virtually every occasion, requiring no particular wealth to pull off with confidence. The democratic implications of a dress with no wrong context were considerable, and the fashion industry has been copying it, debating it, and updating it ever since. Her suits of the 1950s and 60s, the boxy, braided, comfortable jacket worn over a matching skirt, arrived at exactly the right cultural moment. Women entering professional life in larger numbers needed clothes that carried authority without requiring the elaborate maintenance of couture. The Chanel suit was authoritative without being architectural. It travelled without wrinkling catastrophically. It could be worn with different blouses, different accessories, dressed up, dressed down, adjusted for different climates and contexts with minimal effort. It was, in the most practical sense, a working woman's garment. That it came from one of the most commercially successful fashion houses in the world, sold at prices that most working women could not remotely afford, is one of the enduring ironies of Chanel's legacy, designing freedom that only a specific kind of wealthy woman could actually purchase. The idea, however, filtered down. It always did. The idea was the point. In the 1980s, women entering corporate environments in unprecedented numbers wore shoulders. Large, structured, aggressively architectural shoulders that announced presence and claimed space in rooms that had been designed both literally and figuratively for men. The power suit, shoulder pads, strong silhouette, often in dark or neutral tones, was simultaneously a genuine strategic choice and a compromise. Women dressing in a register adjacent to male authority in order to be taken seriously in spaces where female authority had no existing visual template. The shoulder pad did real cultural work. It also, and fashion historians have had some nuanced thoughts about this, required women to approximate the physical dimensions of male authority in order to access power, rather than creating a new visual language of female authority that didn't depend on the male template. The discussion about what women in professional settings should wear never really stopped. It just moved from skirt length to neckline depth, to heel height, to whether your natural hair was professional, a conversation that remains in various forms, very much ongoing. The shoulder pad was not invented in the 1980s. It had appeared in the 30s under Elsa Schiaparelli, in the 40s as a wartime silhouette necessity, and in various iterations through the 50s and 60s. But in the 80s it returned with an ambition and a cultural function it had not previously carried. The women wearing it were not actresses or socialites performing glamour. They were lawyers, bankers, executives, managers, women who had entered professional spaces that had spent centuries organised around male authority, male furniture, male visual culture, and who needed, urgently, a visual shorthand for authority that those spaces would recognise. The shoulder pad was, in that context, a translation device. It translated female presence into a visual language the room already understood. Giorgio Armani was central to the decade's professional women's aesthetic. His deconstructed suits, in fluid fabrics and neutral tones, offered a sophisticated authority that owed something to menswear without being reducible to it. Donna Karan's 7 Easy Pieces system, launched in 1985 and built around a bodysuit as a foundation garment, was explicitly designed for women who moved between professional and social contexts in a single day and needed clothes that moved with them. Both designers were responding to the same real phenomenon: women who were running meetings at 9, picking up children at 6, and attending dinners at 8, and who needed wardrobes that could navigate all three without requiring a costume change or an apology. The conversation about professional dress for women that ran through the 80s and 90s was never really about fashion. It was about legitimacy. Every discussion of whether a woman's skirt was too short, her heels too high, her neckline too low, her hair too natural, her jewellery too noticeable, All of it was a discussion conducted in the vocabulary of clothing, but about something else entirely. Whether she was serious, whether she belonged, whether the room should take her at her own assessment of her capabilities, or whether it reserved the right to assess her by her appearance first and her abilities second. The shoulder pad was one generation's answer to that question. The answer got bigger as the decade went on. By 1989, the shoulders on some women's suits had achieved a scale that required its own structural engineering. The room was going to notice you whether it wanted to or not. In the 1990s, the fashion industry produced something that had not quite existed before in quite the same form. The supermodel, a category of woman so physically exceptional that she was recognizable by a single name: Naomi, Cindy, Linda, Claudia, Christy, and whose body became the template against which ordinary women measured and frequently found wanting their own. The gap between what appeared on runways and in glossy magazines and what constituted a normal female body grew in the 90s to dimensions that researchers began documenting with some alarm. The average model weighed 23% less than the average American woman in 1975. By the mid-90s, that gap had widened significantly. The fashion was beautiful. The clothes were extraordinary. And the implicit message about what bodies were allowed to wear them, visible in every casting decision, every styling choice, every image that ran unretouched, and then increasingly, as the decade wore on, retouched beyond the already exceptional was doing something to the women who consumed it that wouldn't fully be reckoned with for another 20 years. The supermodel phenomenon had a specific origin point. The late 1980s, when a small group of models began to be photographed, marketed and compensated in ways that made them individually recognizable rather than interchangeable. Linda Evangelista's famous remark that she and her colleagues did not get out of bed for less than $10,000 a day was read at the time as either amusing or outrageous, depending on your sympathies, but it was also accurate, and the accuracy was the point. These women were not anonymous mannequins for clothes. They were celebrities in their own right, with recognizable faces and personalities, with management and agents and brand partnerships. The fashion system had created stars from its workforce, and the stars, briefly and remarkably, were more famous than many of the designers whose clothes they wore. What arrived alongside the supermodel was a specific and very particular body standard that went considerably beyond tall and thin into a territory of physical specificity. The exact combination of height, bone structure, proportions and features that had been selected partly by aesthetic preference and partly by the specific technical requirements of the camera and the runway, and then presented to the general public as the correct way for a female body to exist. This is a mechanism worth understanding clearly. A body type selected for its performance under specific industrial conditions was marketed as a general beauty standard to women who did not live under those conditions and whose bodies had not been selected for those qualities. It was like telling everyone they should look like a professional athlete because athletes photograph well at sporting events. The comparison sounds absurd when stated plainly. The mechanism operated continuously regardless. By the mid-90s, the heroin chic aesthetic, gaunt faces, visible collarbones, the appearance of fragility and even illness presented as aspirational, represented the logical endpoint of a trend toward extreme thinness that researchers were documenting in parallel with rising rates of eating disorders among young women. The fashion industry was not the only cause. It was a significant contributor. The conversation about that contribution and about the industry's responsibility for the images it produced and the standards it set would take another decade to reach the point of any meaningful institutional response, and the response when it came was partial and contested. The 90s body standard is over. The mechanism that produced it is not. At various points in the 20th and 21st centuries, different countries have passed legislation either requiring or banning the hijab and other forms of Islamic women's dress. Afghanistan under the Taliban, Iran after 1979, France in public schools after 2004, Turkey and universities for decades, Saudi Arabia across the full scope of public life. The political spectrum of these debates is genuinely strange. Conservative religious authorities demanding covering, secular authorities demanding uncovering. Western feminists historically divided on whether the hijab represents oppression or agency. Muslim women themselves holding a full range of opinions about their own choices, and governments at every point on the political compass deciding that what women put on their heads is, in some essential way, a matter of legitimate state interest. The one consistent thread across centuries of this debate, from ancient Mesopotamia's veiling laws to 21st century French courtrooms, is that what women wear has rarely been treated as a purely private matter. It is always, somehow, also everyone else's business. The reasons given change, the impulse doesn't. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 imposed mandatory hijab on all women in public within weeks of the new government taking power. Women who had not previously worn the hijab, who were secular, who were Christian or Jewish or Zoroastrian, were legally required to cover their hair in public regardless of their personal religious practice or absence of it. The requirement was enforced by morality police. Violations were punishable. The message was not subtle. The new Islamic Republic was announcing its nature through the bodies of its women, using female dress as the most immediate and visible way to signal the break with the previous regime and the new social order. Women who had worn miniskirts in Tehran in 1978 were covering their hair in 1980. Not because they had changed their minds, because the law had changed. France's approach to the same question ran in the precisely opposite direction. The 2004 law banning conspicuous religious symbols in French public schools, understood in practice to target the hijab, was framed in the language of secularism, of republican values, of protecting the neutrality of the public educational space. Girls who wore hijab to school were told to remove it or leave. The French government maintained that it was protecting women's freedom from religious coercion. Many of the women it was ostensibly protecting said clearly and publicly that they were wearing the hijab by choice and did not require the government's protection from their own decisions. The government continued protecting them anyway. The logic of both Iran and France, arriving from opposite ends of the political and cultural spectrum, was functionally identical. The state knows better than the woman what she should be wearing, and the state will enforce that knowledge through law. The woman's own account of her preferences is either irrelevant or suspect. What runs through every iteration of this debate, across every century and culture, is the consistent inability of institutions to treat a woman's clothing as a private matter. The Assyrian who forbade slaves from veiling, the Victorian who required married women to cover their hair, the Iranian revolutionary who mandated covering, and the French secularist who mandated uncovering, all of them agreed on one foundational principle, that what a woman put on her body was a public statement subject to public regulation. The disagreements were about which statement was correct. The agreement about who got to decide was nearly universal. Women, historically, were not on that list. Blue jeans were invented as workwear for California gold miners in 1873. For the next 80 years, they remained practical clothing for labourers, farmers, and working people, not remotely considered appropriate for women, for children in school, for offices, for restaurants, or for anywhere that constituted respectable society. The transformation of jeans from workwear to youth rebellion symbol to universal garment happened in layers. James Dean, in Rebel Without a Cause, in 1955 made them teenage defiance. Rock and roll made them counterculture. The 1960s and 70s made them political. By the 1980s, they had been adopted by high fashion and declared acceptable for almost every context except the most formal. By the 21st century, there are offices that consider dark wash jeans, business casual and wedding receptions where the dress code explicitly specifies jeans welcome. The complete social rehabilitation of a garment once considered the exclusive domain of miners and cowboys into the most universally acceptable garment on earth took approximately 150 years, which is, all things considered, a fairly efficient turnaround for a denim shift of that magnitude. Levi Strauss and Jacob Davis patented the copper-riveted denim work trouser in 1873, designed specifically for the physical demands of mining and outdoor labour, the rivets reinforcing the pocket corners where the fabric failed under strain. For the first 60 years of their existence, jeans were tools, as specialised in their function as a hammer. They were worn by men who worked with their bodies. They were washed rarely, worn until they wore out and replaced without sentiment. The idea that they would one day be sold pre-distressed, pre-faded, and artificially worn at the knees to simulate use at prices significantly higher than new jeans would have been completely incomprehensible to the miners they were made for. This is one of fashion's more elegant jokes. The transition began with post-war American youth culture. Returning veterans had worn practical clothing for years and brought a preference for comfort back with them into civilian life. Their children, the first teenagers, a consumer category that barely existed before the post-war economic boom, adopted jeans as a generational uniform, and because teenage rebellion needs a visible costume, jeans became the costume. James Dean in his Levi's, Marlon Brando in the Wild One, Elvis in denim, the garment accumulated cultural weight through association, each image adding another layer of meaning. When schools banned jeans in the 1950s, they confirmed the garment's rebellious credentials more effectively than any marketing campaign could have managed. You cannot make something desirable to teenagers faster than by telling them they are not allowed to wear it. For women, the jean story has its own specific timeline. Women had worn denim for ranch work and wartime labour since the 1940s, but fashionable jeans for women, cut for a female body, sold in women's departments, considered appropriate for social wear, arrived gradually through the 50s and 60s and became fully mainstream in the 70s. The designer jeans of the late 70s and early 80s, Calvin Klein, Gloria Vanderbilt, Jordache, turned denim into a status garment, a category shift so complete that the basic riveted work trouser was now being sold with the designer's name embroidered on the back pocket, at prices that would have stunned Levi Strauss himself. The miner's pants had become aspirational. The circle was complete, the irony was total, and the jeans were extraordinarily comfortable regardless, which in the end is why they won. At some point in the 2010s, and historians will eventually argue about precisely when, leggings stopped being exercise clothing and became simply clothing. The athleisure trend that swept through fashion from roughly 2012 onward represented something larger than comfort or practicality. It represented the collapse of a boundary that had existed in various forms since the Victorian era, between clothing worn at home and clothing worn in public, between clothing that communicated effort and clothing that communicated ease, between the dressed and the undressed. Schools began banning leggings in dress codes, administrators arguing they were inappropriate, parents arguing the dress code was teaching girls that their bodies were inherently distracting. Offices debated whether yoga pants constituted professional attire. Restaurants quietly updated their smart casual definitions. And women, largely, wore what was comfortable and functional, because the historical argument that what women wore was fundamentally about other people's comfort and other people's opinions had, in the aggregate, been losing ground for approximately 2 centuries, and it continued to lose ground. The technology behind athleisure was genuinely new. The stretchy, moisture-wicking, body-following fabrics that made the yoga pant possible, lycra blends, compression fabrics, technical knits developed originally for athletic performance, were not available to previous generations. The Victorian reformers who had begged for comfortable, movement-friendly clothing were working with wool and cotton, fabrics with real physical limits in terms of stretch, recovery, and durability. What became available in the 21st century was a fabric that moved like a second skin, held its shape wash after wash, and looked sufficiently polished to pass in contexts that earlier activewear would never have attempted. The comfort was real, the functionality was real, and the aesthetic refined by brands like Lululemon, Nike, and 100 competitors who followed in their wake was designed from the beginning to work as everyday clothing as much as workout clothing. The dress code conflicts that followed were entirely predictable and entirely familiar. The arguments made against leggings in schools, that they were distracting, inappropriate, revealing, were structurally identical to the arguments made against miniskirts in the 1960s, against bloomers in the 1850s, against visible ankles in the 1790s. The garment changes, the argument does not. Comfortable clothing on a female body is perpetually available for reframing as provocative clothing on a female body, and the reframing is always presented as being in the interest of the woman wearing it. The leggings ban exists to protect you from distraction, or from judgment, or from being perceived incorrectly. The corset existed to support you, to shape you correctly, to present you well. The veil existed to protect you from unwanted attention. The stola existed to communicate your virtue to strangers on the street. The logic has not changed in 4,000 years. Only the fabric has changed. And the fabric, it turns out, is now extremely comfortable. The body positivity movement, the public, organised assertion that bodies of all sizes, shapes and configurations deserve to be dressed well, represented fairly and treated as fully human, emerged formally in the 1960s in the United States as a response to size discrimination, then gathered significant force through social media in the 2010s. The fashion industry's response was characteristically complicated. Genuine expansion of size ranges at some brands, genuine representation in some campaigns, and alongside both, a parallel phenomenon of performative inclusivity in which plus-size models were cast in advertisements while the same brand's runway shows remained exclusively thin. The fight for representative fashion is, in a sense, the newest iteration of a very old argument about whose body is considered the default body, whose body is considered beautiful, and whose body fashion is fundamentally designed for. Every generation has had its own version of that argument. The terms change. The underlying question, who gets to be dressed, remains remarkably constant. The fat acceptance movement that emerged in the late 1960s, the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance, was founded in 1969, made a simple and radical argument that bodies exist in a range of sizes, that this range is normal rather than pathological, and that the treatment of larger bodies as problems to be solved rather than people to be accommodated was a form of discrimination with real social, medical, and economic consequences. The fashion industry's initial response to this argument was to largely ignore it, because fashion has historically been in the business of creating aspiration rather than accommodation, and aspiration, as practiced by the industry, had always been organised around a specific and narrow body type. Larger sizes were produced, when they were produced at all, as afterthoughts. The same garments graded up without redesign, offered in a smaller range of styles, sold in separate sections, or not offered at all. Social media changed the practical dynamics of this conversation with a speed that the industry had not anticipated. When Instagram and later TikTok gave women of all sizes a direct platform to show themselves wearing clothes, to discuss what fit and what didn't, to build audiences and influence outside the traditional gatekeeping mechanisms of the fashion press, the industry's ability to simply not engage with the question evaporated. Brands that did not offer extended sizing were called out publicly, specifically and repeatedly by large audiences. Brands that offered extended sizing but photographed it poorly, or refused to hire plus-size models above a certain size, or produced the extended sizes in a fraction of the available styles, were identified and discussed with the same directness. The accountability was new. The industry adapted, partially unevenly, in some cases genuinely, and in some cases in ways that were more about managing social media response than changing actual practice. But the direction of travel shifted. The conversation about whose body fashion was for had moved from a niche advocacy position to a mainstream commercial question, and commercial questions, the industry understood, required commercial responses. Whether those responses constituted genuine change or sophisticated performance remained, and remains, very much an open question. For approximately 4,000 years, somebody had opinions about what women should wear. In the 21st century, those opinions have not stopped. They have multiplied, diversified, and moved primarily to the internet, where they can be delivered at scale, instantly, to any woman who posts a photograph of herself in anything. Dress codes in schools continue to be debated. Workplace clothing policies continue to be litigated. Religious dress remains a political flashpoint on multiple continents. And at the same time, there are more women dressing in more ways, with more access to their own sartorial autonomy than at any previous point in history. The woman who wears a hijab by choice, the woman who removes hers by choice, the woman in a power suit, the woman in jeans, the woman who corsets for pleasure and aesthetic, the woman who has never owned a dress. All of them are, in their own ways, the result of every generation of women before them who pushed, argued, legislated, cycled, marched, shortened, lengthened, covered, uncovered, and ultimately refused to let the question of what they wore be answered entirely by someone else. The story of women's fashion is not finished. It has never, in any era, been a story about clothes. It has always been a story about who gets to decide. The internet did not invent the opinion about what women should wear. It industrialized it. A woman posting a photograph of herself in any configuration of clothing in any public forum in the 21st century is subject to assessment at a scale that would have been physically impossible in any previous era. The Victorian moralist could reach his congregation and his newspaper's readership. The Hollywood studio could reach its audience. The fashion magazine could reach its subscribers. The internet reaches everyone instantly, with no friction, no editorial filter, and no closing time. The volume of opinion generated about female appearance online every single day exceeds, in raw quantity, everything produced in every previous era of human history combined. This is not progress. It is the same impulse, the persistent social conviction that women's appearance is public property, running on incomparably more efficient infrastructure. And yet something else is also true and also running on that same infrastructure. The woman who would have been the only person in her town wearing a particular style, the person who would have faced social isolation for dressing outside the local norm, now has access to a global community of people who dress exactly as she does and have built entire vocabularies, aesthetics, and mutual support systems around it. The fat woman who could not find fashionable clothes in her size in any local store can now find designers making specifically for her body and ship directly to her door. The Muslim woman navigating modest fashion in a Western country has access to an international community of designers and stylists working in her aesthetic. The woman who wants to wear the corset as a choice, rather than an obligation, has forums, tutorials, and a community that understands the distinction. The same technology that delivers more criticism faster also delivers more solidarity faster, and the net effect of that is genuinely new in human history. None of this has resolved the underlying argument. Dress codes persist. Legislation about religious dress continues to pass. The fashion industry's standards of representation remain inconsistent. The comment section remains what it is. But the Egyptian woman wrapping her linen in 1300 BCE, the Roman matron pinning her stola, the Victorian woman choosing between the corset she was taught to want and the rational dress she was told was unfeminine, the flapper shortening her hem, the wartime worker drawing a seam up the back of her bare leg in pencil, all of them were navigating some version of the same question that women are navigating right now, getting dressed in the morning. What do I actually want to wear? What am I being told to wear? How far apart are those two things? And what will it cost me today to close that distance? 4,000 years, the same question. Getting dressed was never just getting dressed. It was, and it remains, a small daily act inside a very long argument. And the argument, for all the progress made, is not finished yet. If you have ever assumed that the white wedding dress is an ancient tradition stretching back through the centuries, a timeless symbol of purity so old it practically arrived with civilization itself, you have been the victim of one of fashion history's most successful marketing operations. The white wedding dress is not ancient. It is not timeless. It is not even particularly traditional in the historical sense of the word. It was popularized by one specific woman in one specific year for reasons that had as much to do with displaying the quality of British silk manufacturing as they did with symbolizing anything about the bride's personal virtue. Queen Victoria wore white to marry Prince Albert in 1840. Before that, brides across Europe and America wore their best dress in whatever colour it happened to be, red, blue, brown, green, gold, because the concept of a dress worn once, for a single occasion, and then never again was an extravagance available only to the extremely wealthy. And even the extremely wealthy had not previously decided that the specific extravagance of a single-use white dress was the correct way to spend that money. Victoria changed that. One royal wedding, widely reported and widely imitated, established an aesthetic precedent so powerful that it calcified into cultural law within 2 generations. The symbolism of white as purity arrived after the dress, not before it. Victoria chose white because the silk lace she wanted to showcase was white, and because white photographed, or in her case painted, beautifully, and because she was a queen and could wear an impractical colour to her own wedding without worrying about what she would do with it afterward. The purity symbolism was applied retroactively by a culture that saw a royal bride in white and decided the colour must mean something virtuous, then invented a tradition to explain a choice that had been made for entirely different reasons. This is how a great deal of tradition works, actually. The meaning follows the practice, not the other way around, and then the meaning is declared ancient even when the practice is recent. What happened next is one of fashion's more efficient cultural mechanisms. Women's magazines of the mid-19th century began publishing guidance on wedding dress, and the guidance consistently featured white. Department stores, recognizing a commercial opportunity in the single-use formal garment market, began stocking white wedding dresses and framing them as the correct choice for a respectable bride. By the 1880s, white had become sufficiently normative that wearing another colour to your own wedding was a statement requiring explanation. By the early 20th century, it was essentially mandatory in middle-class Western culture, and the purity symbolism had been attached to it so thoroughly that most people assumed it had always been there. The pressure the white wedding dress created, and continues to create, around the body wearing it is a compressed version of every pressure this script has documented across 4,000 years. The dress must be perfect. The body inside it must be shaped correctly. The presentation must communicate the right things about the woman's virtue, her family's taste, her future husband's prosperity. Bridal magazines are among the most aggressive contemporary purveyors of the idea that a woman's body requires correction before it is suitable for public display on its most important day. The diet plans, the fitness regimens, the shapewear recommendations, all presented as supportive guidance rather than what they functionally are, which is the same argument the corset makers were making in 1860, dressed in different language and sold in different packaging. The white dress changed. The conversation around the body wearing it has not moved nearly as far. The school dress code is one of the most direct and least disguised expressions of the ancient principle that female appearance requires institutional management, applied to the youngest possible subjects with the most explicit possible justification. Girls in schools across the United States, the United Kingdom, and most of the Western world have been navigating dress codes that target their specific bodies, their shoulders, their knees, their collarbone, their midriff, their bra straps, their hair, for as long as compulsory education has existed. The justifications shift with the era. In the 1950s, the concern was modesty and propriety. In the 1980s, it was distraction. In the 2000s, it was professionalism and preparation for the workplace. In the 2010s, it became a flashpoint for discussions about body shaming, racial bias, and whose appearance was treated as inherently problematic. The specific rule changes. The target does not. The target is, consistently and across generations, the female student's body, which is treated as a problem to be managed before the learning can happen. The mechanics of dress code enforcement in schools are worth examining closely because they illuminate the underlying logic with particular clarity. A dress code rule that prohibits skirts above the knee requires enforcement. Someone has to check, measure, and judge. In practice, this means a female student being called out of class, or stopped in a hallway, or sent to an office, or made to stand while an adult assesses the distance between her hemline and her kneecap. The educational interruption is not incidental. It is the consequence. The message delivered, your body is a problem, and this problem takes priority over your education today, is delivered directly and personally and in front of other students. The girl being measured learned something. The students watching her being measured learned something. What they learn has nothing to do with the curriculum. The racial dimension of dress code enforcement is documented and consistent. Natural black hair, afros, locks, braids, twists, has been targeted by school dress codes in the United States and the United Kingdom with a frequency and a specificity that has generated legislation in response. The Crown Act, passed in California in 2019 and adopted by various states since, prohibits discrimination based on hair texture and protective hairstyles. Legislation that was necessary because the discrimination was real, documented, and ongoing. Black girls and young women being sent home from school or excluded from activities because their natural hair was considered unprofessional or inappropriate, were experiencing a direct continuation of a very old principle, that female appearance in its natural state is insufficient, and that the specific natural states belonging to black women are most insufficient of all. The dress code was not the origin of that principle, it was its instrument. The conversation about school dress codes that intensified in the 2010s was, at its most useful, a conversation about what institutions communicate to children about their bodies and whose bodies they communicated about. A dress code that requires girls to cover their shoulders because boys find shoulders distracting is not a neutral administrative policy. It is a lesson delivered daily to everyone in the building about whose education is conditional and whose comfort is the priority. Students noticed. Parents noticed. The arguments made by school administrators in defense of the policies, order, professionalism, focus, were the same arguments that had been made for every dress restriction on women and girls for the past 2 centuries. The students arguing against them were making the same arguments the rational dress reformers made in 1881. The setting was a middle school gymnasium. The argument was not new at all. Somewhere in the history of women's fashion, the conversation shifted from what women were allowed to wear to what women could afford to wear, and then to what women could afford not to think about wearing, which is where fast fashion arrived and changed everything about how the industry worked and who paid the real price for making clothes extremely cheap and extremely temporary. Fast fashion, the model of producing large volumes of inexpensive trend-driven clothing at high speed, replacing collections not seasonally but weekly, and pricing items so low that buying and discarding became easier than repairing and keeping, emerged in its current form in the 1990s and accelerated dramatically through the 2000s and 2010s. It democratized fashion in one sense. A woman with a very small budget could access trend-driven clothing that would have been available only to wealthier consumers in any previous era. It created a different set of costs in every other sense, distributed with a precision that managed to charge them mostly to people who were not buying the clothes at all. The supply chain of fast fashion runs, with very few exceptions, through factories in countries where labour costs are low, regulations are limited, and the workers are overwhelmingly women. Bangladesh, Cambodia, Vietnam, Ethiopia, the geography shifts as costs shift, but the workforce is consistent. The women sewing the clothes that sell for $12 in Western retail stores earn wages that vary by country, but are uniformly a fraction of what a living wage would require, working in conditions that range from difficult to genuinely dangerous. The Rana Plaza factory collapsed in Bangladesh in 2013. A building that housed multiple garment factories and killed over 1,100 workers, the majority of them women, was the most visible single event in a decade of growing awareness about fast fashion supply chain. The building's structural failures had been reported. Workers had been told to return anyway. They were sewing clothes for Western brands when the building came down. The environmental costs ran alongside the human ones. Fashion is the second largest industrial water consumer in the world. The dyeing and treatment of textiles accounts for approximately 20% of global industrial water pollution. Synthetic fabrics, polyester, nylon, acrylic, shed microplastics with every wash, entering water systems and accumulating in ecosystems at rates that researchers are still quantifying. The cheap dress that costs $12 and lasts 3 washes before pilling irreparably does not disappear when it is thrown away. It goes to a landfill or to a second-hand market in Ghana or Chile that is now overwhelmed with Western discards at volumes it cannot absorb. The phrase "throw away fashion" contains the assumption that throwing things away makes them gone. It does not make them gone. It makes them someone else's problem, and the someone else is very reliably in the global south and not in the mall where the dress was purchased. The women buying fast fashion and the women making it are connected by a supply chain that is structured to ensure they never quite see each other clearly. The price point creates distance. The branding creates aspiration. The volume creates the sense that cheapness is abundance rather than extraction. What the history of fashion has always done: distribute the cost of women's appearance unequally, with the heaviest share landing on women with the least power to refuse. Fast fashion performs at a global scale, at a speed previous eras could not have achieved, and with a visibility that, now that it exists, cannot entirely be looked away from. The sticker says $12. The full price is considerably higher. It is just being paid somewhere the buyer cannot see. And so, here we are. At the end of 4,000 years of women getting dressed in the morning, you've travelled through all of it tonight. The woven air of ancient Egypt, the pinned and pleated chitons of Greece, the legally designated stolas of Rome. You've watched the hennin rise 2 feet above a noblewoman's head and the crinoline expand 6 feet in every direction. You've sat with the corset, all those centuries of compression, and with the women who wore it willingly, and the women who cut it off, and the women who never stopped to ask whether they had a choice. You've watched hemlines climb and fall and climb again, each inch of movement tracked by newspaper editorials, church sermons, and state legislatures who had collectively decided that the distance between a woman's knee and the floor was a matter of civilizational importance. It never was, of course. It was always about something else. It was always about who gets to take up space, and how much, and in what shape, and with whose permission. The clothes were the argument. The women were the point. What's remarkable, genuinely, quietly remarkable, is not how much control was exercised over what women wore. It's how consistently, in every era, women found the edges of that control and pushed against them. The Roman women who organised in the Forum and got Cato's sumptuary law repealed. The medieval noblewoman who kept building her hat taller despite the priest at the door. Amelia Bloomer printing her patterns anyway. The suffragists who calculated coldly and correctly which battles were worth the cost. The flappers who shortened their hems while state legislatures drafted bills to stop them. The wartime worker drawing a seam up the back of her bare leg in pencil because silk had gone to the war effort and she was going to look like herself regardless. Mary Quant raising the hem another inch every season and watching the editorials chase her upward. The girls in the school hallway arguing back. None of them were making grand historical statements in the moment. They were just getting dressed. But the accumulation of those small daily decisions, the persistent, unglamorous generation after generation refusal to be entirely told, is one of the quieter revolutions in human history. It did not happen in a single dramatic moment. It happened every morning, in bedrooms and dressing rooms and factories and palaces, in every language and every era, one woman at a time deciding what she was going to put on her body today, and whether that decision was entirely going to be someone else's. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep in whatever you chose to wear to bed, whether that's something deliberate or something practical or just the first thing you grabbed, maybe take a moment to appreciate the extraordinary, unlikely, hard-won ordinariness of that choice. The Egyptian woman managed her linen under someone else's rules. The Victorian woman laced herself into someone else's ideal. The flapper danced in her own, finally, and paid a social price for it. The wartime worker earned it in a factory. Every generation moved the line a little further. You're the end of a very long chain of women who dressed themselves forward. The lights are low. The day is done. The clothes are on the floor or on the chair or folded correctly if you're that kind of person, and there is no need to be any particular shape tonight. No silhouette required. No hemline to negotiate. No social order to reflect back correctly in wool and linen and gold thread and denim. Just you. Just rest. Just sleep. You've earned it. So did they.